All right, it is July 29th, 2024. I am in the home of Mr. Terrence Egan, F-100 fighter pilot and Vietnam veteran. Mr. Egan, when and where were you born, sir?
Born August 10th of 1940, means I got a birthday coming up in about 12 days. And I was born in a little town called Pinellas Park, Florida, which is a suburb of St. Petersburg, Florida, in the Tampa Bay area.
Yes, sir. Now, what did your parents do?
My dad worked for a power company in a executive position with a power company, and my mom just was a mom, yeah, housewife and mom, and raised myself and my brother, 6 years younger than I am. Yeah.
So, born in 1940, you grew up through World War II in Korea. So, what was your childhood like growing up for what you remember?
Well, I don't remember anything about WW2 being born. When it was over, I was 5 years old. So my memory doesn't go back that far at all. But I remember, of course, uh, Korea had came along when I was 10, 11 years old. But my memories back then, those days were, school, playing sports, things like that. Just the things that you did in the 50s, which was sock hops and uh, and drive-in theaters and things like that. Listening to Elvis Presley in the mid 50s as he made his way on the stage, the big stage. So remembering WW2 in Korea, what I've read is about it, and I've done some reading on it, and I visited all the memorials in Washington D.C., and I have a great respect for all those that served in any conflict.
Yes, sir. Well, and getting into your music taste real quick, you mentioned Elvis. Was there anybody else besides Elvis Presley you were really into?
Well, I still like the 50s. In other words, if I have my radio set on one station, and it really just plays the old music. It's Escape is a station. I think it's like station 149 on Sirius Radio. The days of CDs and 8 tracks and all that have all passed by. But if I'm going to turn on a radio and listen to music, it's going to be something that's soft on my ears and also takes me back to the 50s or 60s.
Yes, sir. Understood that. Now, as you're growing up, getting into high school, where do you find yourself going to college at?
Well, I was a I wasn't a rebel rouser, but I had my mom told me when I went away to college that she was going to send me as far away as possible. She was tired of my ranting and raving and being that 17-year-old teenager. And so I had just two football scholarships. One was the Citadel, and one was University of Idaho. And she opted to send me to Idaho. She said that's further away than the Citadel was, that's for sure. So after graduation in '58 from high school, I went off to be an Idaho Vandal in Moscow, Idaho.
Now, what position were you playing in football at that time?
I went out there as a tackle. It was pretty good size at 6'3", 250. Especially back in the 50s, that was big. And then I moved to tight end when I was out there. So,
How was the football team when you were there?
well, we were in the Pacific Coast Conference. So every year we lined up against USC, Cal, Stanford, UCLA, Washington State, Oregon State, and we got our butts kicked. But we were by far the smallest school. We were only 4,000 students, and three-quarters of them were Mormon, so they didn't play football. No, that's not a nice thing to say at all. But we were small compared to the other schools in the Pacific Coast Conference, which dissolved about my junior year out there. Idaho was kicked out, and we went back to being Division II football after that.
Now, did things get a little better football wise in the Division II sector?
Yeah, they did. We had winning seasons. Our coach was a guy named Skip Staley, who invented the kicking tee of all things. And then he left my sophomore year, junior year, and a guy named D. Andrews came in, who went on to be a coach at Oregon State and coached the Heisman Trophy winner there named Terry Baker, who was a quarterback back in the early 60s.
Wow. Pretty immaculate considering all the coaches that you have involved in your life at that time, as well as the teams you're playing, and probably some well-known athletes eventually in the NFL.
Well, yeah, the year I went out there in '58. They had a tradition that the graduating seniors would come back, and in our spring practice to wrap it up, we would have a game against the alumni. Well, the alumni the year before I got there graduated Jerry Kramer, who played for the Packers, is in the Hall of Fame. Uh, a guy named I can't remember his name right now, but they end up with 5 NFL players drafted off that team of 1957 that went on and played in the NFL and had storied careers. They came back and they beat us. The alumni beat the varsity, and that never happens. The spring game is just a showcase of what you got for next year, and the alumni just sort of show up and open a keg of beer and have a good time. But no, they beat us. Yep.
Well, as you go through college and playing football, of course, but what were you studying at the time?
I studied mainly, well, I was in business, and accounting is what I studied with a major or a minor in English. And I was not a star student. I was managed to get by and and graduate. I did have a year interrupted when after my freshman year, I left to go play football. I thought I was going to play at Florida State, and then went down there and then decided to go back to Idaho. So I graduated a year late. 63 is when I graduated instead of 62. And but so I did major in business administration, marketing, accounting, and a minor in English.
Well, and through all this, and we talked briefly at lunch, all of this with your time at Idaho eventually segues you to the Air Force. So, what led to that moment?
Well, like we said at lunchtime, I had to take ROTC. It was required because it's a land grant school, and so I had to do 2 years. And my options were Army, Navy, and or Air Force, and I chose to go with the Air Force. And then after 2 years, everybody took the AFOQT test, and you didn't have to go follow up and go through the third and fourth year on ROTC. But if you did, then you had to be commissioned as a second lieutenant, or would be commissioned upon graduation, and then would have to fulfill either as a non-pilot 4 years, or if it's a pilot, you had to fulfill a 6-year commitment to the service. And I took the test and qualified to be a pilot. And like I told you before, I said, well, I'm not interested in aviation, or I've never flown. In fact, I hitchhiked out to school. And so they said, well, it's an extra $100 a month. I said, well, you can put me in that. I'll do that. So I ended up, without an interest in aviation, going into being a pilot. At which in your fourth year there, they give you about 30 hours in a light airplane, Piper Tri-Pacer, and just to get your private license. So I did that. That was a lot of fun. I said, I think I'm going to enjoy this piloting. So, and then I end up as a senior, I end up being the commander of the Air Force Corps out there, and which was, it was only one, and I was fortunate enough to be selected to be the cadet commander of the Air Force ROTC.
Well, and as we go through that, your first little private flying lessons there, was that the first time you'd ever flown?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it was. I mean, I had never flown commercially before at all. And every time we went somewhere with the family, we didn't have our private car as a means of transportation. We were on a Greyhound bus. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the inside of Greyhound bus stations growing up. Trips with my dad back to Michigan, where his roots were, and even going back and forth to school to Idaho. I hitchhiked out there basically. And on one time I did take a train, most of the way from Chicago to Spokane, Washington, which was pretty neat. So I had never flown before till I got that little light airplane. And after about 10 hours in it, the instructor jumps out and says, fly it around the pattern and make a landing or two. And that was sort of scary. You're all by yourself now. And but 35 hours later, I was a private pilot, and thought I was ready to go tackle the world of aviation.
Now, As you, of course, graduate from college, you get your orders to report for basic training, I assume, or
No
some.
basic training.
Ah,
No,
there we
no,
go.
you directly from now during ROTC, if you go on to advance, you have to spend one summer with sort of an indoctrination program. And I went to Sumter, South Carolina Shaw Air Force Base, and got to do an indoctrination to the service. What you basically do is attend classes. They fly you around in a T-33 just to get you some experience, try and get you sick. They give you a barf bag, and then the whole purpose is to make you get airsick. I didn't fall for that though, so it didn't bother me at all. But so you do that the summer of your junior year. Then after graduation, you're simply waiting for your assignment to pilot training class. And mine, I wanted to go in right away. I needed the money. I needed the pay. And it was about, and they had put me down to go in about a year later. And so I called my U.S. Senator, George Smathers was his name at the time. And I said, can you do me a favor and try and get me into the pilot training sooner? Within a week, I got my assignment, about cut 6 months off my waiting period. So in November of 63, I entered pilot training in Class 65D in Enid, Oklahoma Advanced Air Force Base.
Now, as we talked about at lunch, that was the day after Kennedy's
It
assassination,
was
correct?
the day I was in a motel there on the 22nd when it flashed across the screen on the black and white TV that we had in our motel room, because we weren't reporting until the next day to the base. And that flashed across the screen on the afternoon. I think might have been midday. I can't remember. On the 22nd, and then I entered the service on the 23rd of November of 63.
Well, speaking of the Kennedy assassination, how did you feel at that moment when you heard that the president had been
Well,
assassinated?
totally devastated. Well, disbelief, I shouldn't say. It was about like when 911 hit. We were in a restaurant in Denellen, Florida, and chomping down on some eggs and some crispy bacon when it came across at 911, and we sat there in disbelief and said, this is something out of the Twilight Zone. It was just surreal. Yeah.
Now, from Kennedy's assassination, of course, going into pilot training the next day in itself, for advanced training, I should say, did you expect any kind of perhaps conflict or any other kind of attempted assassinations or anything crazy to go on?
No, no. I was engrossed in the follow-up, the Lee Harvey Oswald situation, and just the news reporting. But I had no, I didn't feel like this was a large coup and something that needed to be, on a national scale needed to be addressed. I didn't think it was a conspiracy. No.
Yes, sir. So, as you get into that initial training, as we said at lunch, the first 2 weeks were spent ground school, correct?
Yes.
And what were they teaching you in those 2 weeks?
Well, basically, you're in the book. Let's just learn about navigation, reading maps, just general stuff to get you ready about the airplane you're going to go into, the T-37. So a lot of it was about the airplane itself and what have you. So it was just an indoctrination, not necessarily into the Air Force. That would come, later on as you were in the service. But this was mainly about get you ready to fly the airplane.
Now, what was your opinion of the T-37 at that time?
Say what?
What
opinion. A noisy little thing. I'll tell you one thing. And hence the name, the Tweety Bird. It just made this high-pitched noise. And of course, it was side-by-side tandem seating in that thing. And that's so the instructor, when he wanted to get your attention, could reach over and grab your oxygen mask and squeeze off your supply of air. And it worked. And I had many times where my instructor would reach over there and twist my mask around to get my attention. But it was a capable airplane. It really was. It served a good purpose. Unfortunately, it's not with us anymore. They took it out of service and actually converted that thing into a ground attack airplane too, that a lot of the third world countries still use today.
Now, with the T-37 at the time in 1963, or I assume we're going through basic flight maneuvers in itself, getting accustomed to advanced aircraft compared to a Piper Cub.
Oh yeah, I mean it was the transition was absolutely amazing. You're sitting there in a Piper Tri-Pacer chugging along at 110 mile an hour, and the Tweety Bird wasn't fast, but it still would do about 280, something like that. So you're going 2.5 times the speed that you're used to. It's like, jumping out of a 35-mile-an-hour zone in your car and hitting the highway and going 70. It's just things are going by a lot faster, and therefore you have to make your decision making has to speed up also, and depending upon the situation, you didn't have a lot of time to think about things.
Now, for the training period, what kind of pattern did they have you going on around the airfield? Just basic flight maneuvers? Did they have any areas
Oh yeah,
designated for?
we had areas where we would go and do certain things like stalls and any maneuvers that occupied a lot of vertical airspace. And those were zones that other aircraft couldn't fly into, and they were strictly reserved for training. And then when you're in training out there, there were other Tweety Birds out there, so you had to be in contact with them because you did everything from stalls to spins. In other words, you were taught the performance level of the airplane and were trained to handle any situation that may come up that was out of the ordinary. Yeah.
Now, speaking of just the flying in general, the weather, did the weather play an impact out there in those initial flight days with wind or any kind of rain, snow, or anything of that nature?
No, and that's the reason most of the undergraduate pilot training bases, UPT bases, were based where the weather was going to be good. Because you had to have a lot of sunshine and VFR weather, because we weren't even IFR qualified at the time. We were primarily initially, it came later when we got into instrument flying, they would literally pull over, your part of the cockpit, they drop it like a shade down so you could not see out and you had to fly instruments. But initially, when you were getting used to the airplane and getting checked out to solo in the airplane, that was all under visual flight conditions, and the weather was usually pretty good out there. Other than we did have some problems with tornadoes at times. They never hit the base, but they were dancing all around us at times out there in Oklahoma. Yep.
No, I bet that was interesting to see from 10,000 feet.
Well, no, actually, we were usually in the officers' club having a drink when they went dancing from Wichita to Oklahoma City, north to south. Not every day, but it was frequent that we would see little dusters, not real big ones. I mean, these guys were, I don't even know if they'd classify them as a tornado in those days. They were just sort of little dusters that were dancing up and down the highway.
Well, and mentioning that of just dancing up and down the highway, thinking about the flying, what was your first solo like in the T-37?
Well, what happens is you don't know when it's coming. In other words, you're being doing, let's say touch and goes, and then the instructor will say, "Okay, let's stop here, and we'll land and we'll taxi off." And he says, "Okay." He opens the canopy, he jumps out, and he goes to what they call a mobile control station, which is right out there at the end of the runway, where he has radio contact with you, and he says, "Okay, you're all by yourself now." And so you take off, and it's strictly in the pattern. And it was an overhead pattern. You'd fly what we call initial approach. You would pitch out to a downwind approach, and then base the final. And he's talking you through the whole thing. Had one funny incident out there. Wasn't me, fortunately, but a good guy named Bill Hoffman. Crazy, crazy, crazy guy. Instructor got out and went to mobile control unit, which is just a little unit right there at the end of the runway, like a trailer, and told this guy to take off. And the guy, he misread his airspeed indicator. The T-37 would do about 280. He read it as you're supposed to fly initial approach at 200 knots, then pitch out. Well, he is doing 280, thinking he was doing 180, and it took the instructor forever to get him to slow down the airplane to get it on the ground, and he never lived that down. He bought drinks at the bar for the next 2 weeks after that.
Well, and speaking of the bar and the O Club for the period in itself, what was the popular drink at the time?
Most everybody did not drink hard liquor there, mainly because you had to get up the next day and perform. And so Oak Club time was usually limited to Friday night, and after the flight line emptied on Friday, everybody went there, and most everybody we just had a beer or a glass of wine, and we lived right there in the barracks. Our barracks were nice. We're right at the club, and I can remember one night one of our members got a little bit looped, and we're in our flight suit and we're walking out and we're heading toward our barracks, and he decides he wants to jump in the pool. Well, the only thing was, it was wintertime. The pool had been drained, and this guy jumps from the deep end into the pool, thinking he's going to get wet and sober up. And whap! He hit the bottom of that pool, and it took 3 of us to drag him out of the thing.
How was he feeling the next day?
Oh, he was. In fact, he had to go to the infirmary, and he missed. And unfortunately, the next day was a Saturday, and then Sunday, so he had 2 days to recover. And he was banged up a little bit, but he was back on the flight line on Monday morning. Yep.
Wow. Now, for all of the guys in your initial training class here at this point, did all of them want single seat fighters, or were they trying to go for?
They a lot of them felt that they really were just wanted to get some time in to go with the airlines. So a lot of them in those days said multi-engine would be better as far as getting experience goes. So some of them wanted that, but how they did it was you had this list of airplanes that were up when you were up for graduation, and you put your choices down. Don't put just one choice. You may not get your first choice, so you would list it. And usually the fighters would go first. They did in our class, followed by MATS. At that time, it was Military Air Transport Service. Now they're part of Tactical Air Command, but C-130s, C-124s were even in there. And last was always SAC. Nobody wanted to go, and we had a bunch of B-47s and B-52s, but nobody really wanted to be in SAC and fly those. So if you were at the bottom of your class, that's where you were probably going to end up in SAC. And so they rated you academically, they rated you flying, and they rated you in both airplanes. So you had a cumulative score at the end of the year, and then we had 45 in our class, and number 1 through 45. 45 got what was left over, unfortunately. Yeah.
Now, just for the sake of the interview, why didn't anybody want to go to Strategic Air Command?
Well, mainly the big thing was the mission they were flying. You would gear up and you'd be up there for 15, 18 hours. Good way to accumulate flying time real fast. But the thing that people want to do is make landings and takeoffs, and that's the fun part of flying. Putting it on autopilot and droning through the skies, which I did commercially for 25 years. It has its benefits, but it's also not a very fun way to fly. I mean, flying, you want to have hands on and be doing something, and the way to do that was mainly with a stick in your hand and not a wheel.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, and I know when we talked at lunch, I asked you if the F-100 was the plane that you wanted. So why the F-100?
Well, mainly the mission that it flew, and it was the first supersonic airplane in the world. And even though it was old at the time, it came out in the early 50s, 53, it was still a large presence. And I knew that I was probably going to have to go to Vietnam. I knew that my commitment initially 63 through 69, I said 6 years you had to do. I knew that I was going to end up in Vietnam, and I said, I want to be in control of my destiny. I don't want to be sitting, up there being targeted. If I'm going to get shot down or shot at, I want to be in control of my destiny. So I wanted to fly the F-100. Yeah. And we didn't have. I would have liked to have flown the Thunder Chief, the 105, but we didn't have any of those in our class at all. So that wasn't an option. Like I mentioned before, we had a 106, and we had 2 RF-4s, and 1 F-100 went to our class. And there were 4 F-100 slots available, and I ended up getting one of the 4, which I felt very fortunate. Yep.
Well, I know at lunch it was very humorous to hear you tell this, but how did you end up making sure that you secured one of those
Oh yeah,
F-100
yeah.
slots?
Well, when the list came down, there's a lot of badgering and you're vying. You say, oh, I'll probably get this. I'll probably get that. Well, I ended up. I was number one in my class in flying, but my academics dropped me down a little bit, so I ended up number four overall. And the uh, number one guy, Rod Benson was his name. I knew that he was sold on that 106. He didn't want to go overseas. RF4 was in Alconbury, which was England. And I know he didn't want the F-100. He wanted Delta Dart. So I wasn't too worried about him. But number two and number three, I really had to push that RF4. And I kept telling him, boy, I tell you, that's something I'm really I want one of those. I want that slot to Alconbury, even though you're going to be sitting in the back of the airplane, because that's where they started off when it was F4 first came out. They didn't even have pilots back there. Then they started putting they call them uh, gifts, guys, and well, we won't use the word, but that's what they were called, gifts. And so I pushed it, and they bit. They took those two slots, and I snapped that F-100 right up. I was so proud of my statesmanship and my diplomacy in selling that RF4 to those other two guys.
You'd have been one heck of a car salesman.
Yeah, I did that too.
Now, with picking that F-100 slot, I assume it was a big day for everybody the day that they get to pick their slot. Did you have to do any further training to prepare you for the F-100?
No, no, none whatsoever. I like I said, we finished up in December, and then I had to go to. I had to, first I had to report to uh, survival training, and that was in middle of January or February. I can't remember. It's Stead Air Force Base outside of Reno, Nevada. Miserable place to go, but it was required. And from there, then I went on down to start my training at Luke Air Force Base in the F-100, uh, which is right outside of Phoenix. So it was, it's just bingo. I got my pilot training class out of the way, and bingo, survival training, and off the F-100 training, which lasted about 6 months. So that put me eligible for my assignment. And there were four of us in that class. Uh, Three of us went to RAF Wethersfield in England, and one of them went to Lakenhood, RAF. I think it's Lakenhood. Anyway, it's also in England. That's where and he was a major. He was our class commander in the F-100 when we went through that class. Yep.
So, what was your first introduction to the F-100 like?
Well, we'd been flying the T-38 supersonic airplane. Uh, the big thing is when we got there, the first thing they did was show that film of the Sabre Dance, where a guy got behind the power curve and tried to go around and didn't have enough power, had his nose too high, and of course did this Sabre Dance on a runway, ended up crashing off to the side, and he actually survived that, but he ended up drowning, believe it or not, because he had thrown up in his mask and couldn't get it off, and he was injured to the point where he ended up dying from actually strangulation rather than from his injuries. But they show you that to give you respect. The F-100 uh, had a real control problem. It didn't have enough rudder on it, and when they came out with the C model, it didn't have it just didn't have enough rudder, and it didn't have leading edge slats on it too. So you were landing that thing at 170 miles an hour. Now the D model was a model that I ended up in, and the D and the F, which is a two-seat trainer model of the F-100, and it was a vast improvement. But you had to fly it all the time. I mean, you could not relax with the F-100. Didn't have any autopilot on it, so anytime you're making any sort of a long trip, like crossing the Atlantic, and we had to ferry or hit tankers all the way across, you didn't have any autopilot. You're flying that thing for 12 hours straight. Uh, but it was we lost a lot. No, we didn't lose a lot of people, but a lot of people. Adverse yaw was a problem in the F-100. Anytime you got the nose up, you got speed was down a little bit, like your turn from base to final. If you didn't use that rudder on that airplane, you would end up having adverse yaw and be in a lot of trouble. And it was an airplane that it deserved your attention all the time. And after a while, you learned how to respect the airplane, but you definitely had fly it. It was not a very forgiving airplane at all.
Now, with that being said, you see this video. Did that give you any kind of nerves or anxiety of stepping into the F-100, or were you
No.
ready to grab it?
Oh, no. I had enough experience at that time. Not a lot of experience. We come out of pilot training with probably 240 hours, about 120 in a 37, 120 in the T-38. So you're still a novice, but you've got enough training behind you. And this was all jet time that, given the reputation of the F-100, you just knew that, you don't attack an alligator by jumping on his head. You sort of grab his tail first. So that's the same thing with the F-100. Just don't go in there thinking that you're going to whip this beast right away, because it took a lot to learn how to fly it. And I ended up, fortunately, getting about 1,200 hours in the F-100. So it was really a really enjoyable airplane to fly. Yeah, a classic.
So, for your first flight in the F-100, what was that experience like to truly sit behind a top-of-the-line jet in the United States Air Force's arsenal?
Well, of course, I was with another pilot, an instructor. You don't solo in that airplane, just like any airplane, until the instructor says, "Well, I think you're ready to go on yourself." But it was fun. It's really sort of an underpowered airplane. You had 12,700 pounds of thrust at mill power, which is 100% power. And then with afterburner, you had 16,000. And the airplane was about a 2-to-1 weight to thrust ratio, which is not good by today's standards. You take most of your airplanes today will have 1-to-1, thrust to weight ratio. So it was sort of underpowered, and it had a tendency for that afterburner to give you sometimes a hard light, sometimes it wouldn't light at all, which means you weren't going anywhere, because the fans would open up like that, the tail would open up, but you didn't have any additional thrust. So when you first jumped in that thing, you were a little apprehensive, just like anything that's new. But it's just like a good fitting shoe. It didn't take long to be broken in.
Yes, sir. So, stepping into the F-100 and being even there with an instructor, how roomy is the cockpit in there?
Well, it's not roomy at all, and of course there's no computers in that thing at all. It's all analog, and that's one thing too that a lot of people don't realize, that if you say, well, this guy's 6'4". Is he too tall to be a pilot? Well, what they did is they measured your sitting height, and your sitting height, especially if you're going into fighters, couldn't be over a certain height, because you couldn't close the canopy, and you had to have clearance, because if you had to eject the airplane, the first thing you have to do is, when you raise the handles to eject, it blows the canopy, and you don't want it to take your scalp off. So sitting height was very, very important in that thing. But it was very, very basic inside. You had enough instruments to fly an instrument, but it was, like I said, there was no autopilot or anything else. So it was very basic. It was made back in the 50s. So, and it was rushed. It really followed the Sabre, which is the F-86, and it did have ailerons, which when you compare it to, like in Vietnam, we would say, all right, could we fight against a MiG-15? Yeah, we could, no problem. How about a MiG-17? Yeah, we could do a MiG-17. and when we're talking about dogfighting, using certain techniques. How about at 19? No, you couldn't do it. The thing about the F-100 was if you got that thing slow, it was slow to accelerate. You could firewall that throttle and it would eventually accelerate, but it didn't have just enough kick and pep to, to get you out of a real dangerous situation like in a dogfight. Uh, so initially it was just all getting used to. The cockpit was roomy enough, but certainly it was just it was a Model T compared to a Tesla. It was old. It was an old airplane.
Well, speaking of the dogfighting aspect, thinking about what happens when the F-100 does get slow. So for the pilots, you kind of have to keep in the back of your mind that a key to success is managing your energy. Don't get low and slow.
Well, and also your flight envelope is very important. If we were, and when we were flying, we would fly up north, and we would harass VIN, V-I-N-H, V-I-N-H. They had MiG-15s and MiG-17s here, and we go up there and harass them, fly down the runway, and then get the hell out of there and see if they would launch anything to come after us. But we knew that if we stayed below 5,000 feet, we could take on the MiG-15 and the MiG-17. If we got any higher than that, because anytime you went into a bank, you pull 4 Gs in that F-100, you're going to lose airspeed real fast. And at higher altitude, it's slower to accelerate. So your flight envelope for dogfighting in the F-100 was 5,000 feet down to ground level.
Wow. So with that being said, too, speaking of 5,000 feet, that's not a lot of room to work with if you think about a dogfight, think about energy.
You're not fighting vertically at that altitude. You're fighting horizontally. You just don't have enough altitude to fight a vertical fight. Plus, that's one thing you didn't want to do in the F-100 is get slow. If you did, then we would. The only way really to escape it was to go ahead and get zero speed, kick it over, let it nose down, zero airspeed, and then let it straight down, accelerate that way. And that way we could usually get away from any aggressive maneuver that any enemy fighter would do. But that was a last ditch maneuver, was to pull it up, stall it, roll it over on one wing, and unload the G capacity and pull negative Gs and just go straight down and accelerate.
So with that in mind, I guess part of the success for the F-100 in a dogfight would be to work in a pair. That way that you and your wingman are able to work together to knock out the enemy fighter that you're engaging.
Absolutely, yeah. It's and I can't remember the guy's name right now. He's very famous for his concepts on dogfighting. Last name starts with a B, and I'd have to look it up. Doug something. But anyway, it's when you were out flying and you were in a situation where you may encounter enemy aircraft, you weren't flying formation. You always had one of your wingmen, or if you had more than one wingman, they'd be at a high perch. They'd be several thousand feet above you, so they could look at you, and yet they would be abeam you, so you could also look at them. In case you were attacked from the 6 o'clock position, then he would be able to come in and help defend you. Yeah. So that was how we always flew our formation if we thought we might encounter enemy aircraft.
Now, leading up to that, of course, even to the training process, what kind of armament is the F-100 working with in an aerial dogfight?
Well, we had nothing sophisticated. Everything was ballistic, so we didn't have the luxury of having anything that was infrared or anything that was smart bombs. So in a dogfight, all we had were 4 20-millimeter cannons, and we had 800 rounds, and we would fire 6,000 rounds a minute. So you really only had, and you didn't want to fire all 4 guns at once, you could do it, but you'd lose about 60 knots of airspeed right away with all those bullets coming out. And plus they're coming out right in other words, they're on both sides of the airplane. There's upper and lower, and the canisters. There's 4 canisters in there. They hold 200 rounds each. And not only would you lose a lot of airspeed if you fired all 4 cannons at one time, but there's a good chance that you might even have a loss of air flowing through the engine, and have a compressor stall is what they would call it. That happened. That happened quite a bit when we were down in Wheelis in North Africa, in Libya. They had some old GAMS missiles, and they're GAMS 7s, and they were just there. And they said, "Why don't you take these out and shoot them just to fire some armament or some ordnance that's just sitting here not being used, and they're old." And this one you had a joystick. That's all you had. When you fired this thing, you had this joystick and you try and guide it into a target down there. Well, and this thing went off, man, it just compressor stalled the airplane, and to the point where you thought that engine's going to fail on you. So everything we dropped, it was a very good platform for air to ground. It was the best platform. We used to go down there against the F4s, the 105s, and the F-100s down at Wheelis. Would all be down there, and we'd have these contests at the range, and nobody could beat the F-100. We could not do it. It was a very, very stable airplane for dropping rockets, for firing the cannons, and also for dive bombing, cluster bombs. And it was just a very, very stable platform. And that's the reason it was so widely used in Vietnam, was the fact that it was a good air-to-ground airplane. Air-to-air? No. Air-to-ground, very good.
Well, and with air to ground coming into mind, and of course the conflict in Vietnam, was a lot of your training in the States and in England prior to low level altitude, nap of the earth flying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, when I was in England, 65 through 68, that was in the middle of the Cold War. And so we set nuclear alert over there. And so we had, Mark 28s, Mark 43s, and Mark 57 nuclear bombs, and we would sit in shelter. Well, all those, once you reached, if you were to launch, you would get certification to launch, and you would authenticate, and then you'd go past your no-go point. And then, but everything that when you had your final run in from your final point to the target, had to be memorized. I mean, because in time, because a lot of times you'd be flying over nothing but craters and holes that bombs had been dropped before you, and it was pretty interesting. So we did a lot of low level nav. Now, low level nav in England is tricky because the weather is not that good. So usually, if we did any low level navs, it would be down in Africa, flying over the desert to find an oasis out there somewhere. But so a very, very important part of it was our low level mission. And we also deployed to Turkey, which was good for flying low level, and also to Aviano, Italy. We deployed there, and we also did a lot of low level over there. But in England, it was very difficult because of the weather. Yep.
Oh, certainly. Well, and I guess flying in Turkey and in Italy, that prepared you a lot for flying close air support through South Vietnam with those ridges and those mountains.
Yeah.
And having to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, because of the bad weather in England, we had no gunnery ranges. In other words, we had no place to go and do conventional gunnery. We did have a couple ranges where we could practice nuclear drops, weather permitting. So all our gunnery had to be done at Wheelis Air Force Base in Tripoli. In Aviano, we had a range there also. So those were the only 2 places. And so we deployed to those places quite a bit just to get requirements in. Every 6 months, you had to have, excuse me, so many, drop so many ordnances and bombing, rockets, strafing, and also nuclear. But we could do the nuclear in England, but all our conventional work had to be done in Africa or in Italy.
Wow. Now, With that, thinking of some of the aerial gunnery practice in itself. So take us through a little bit. If you're on the range, how do you enter the range if we're going to drop some 500-pound bombs on target?
Okay, well, we're not dropping 500-pound bombs. We are dropping 25-pound bombs that simulate the trajectory of a 500-pound bomb. And so you had a range time, and the range was 5 minutes away from the actual base. So it's a matter of gear up, flaps up, turn along the coast, and you were right there at the range. And there was always a range controller was there every day. He would fly down earlier and open up the range and make sure it was clear, and then he would clear you in. And you would communicate to him with, all right, we're rolling in for dive bomb, and you would spread out into formation where only one airplane, and we usually didn't go down there with more than two, was on a run at any given time. And we also had a range down there at Wheelus where it was open. In other words, we could pick out targets, and they had tanks, and they had all sorts of stuff in there. The unfortunate thing was a lot of the locals down there, we used to get in there to try and find casings, copper casings from our ammo and what have you, because that was a viable commodity that they could trade for money and for what have you. And a lot of times we end up shooting the Arabs. They had a lot of them. I mean, several of them get shot by us because they were in a place where they weren't supposed to be. It was fenced off, but they would get in there anyway just to look for casings from ammo, and it was unfortunate, but it happened quite a bit. So, but the range itself, the conventional range, was always monitored and controlled, and you had to have clearance to drop every time you went and rolled in. You're clear to drop, or he'd say, no, you're not clear to drop. There's a problem. So everything that we did on the ranges was controlled. Well, the big range, because in combat, you don't roll in the same heading in the same direction every time. You have to vary it because of enemy ground fire. And that's what the big range, the open range, did for you. You could roll in and you pull off, and you come back in a different direction to attack another target, usually a jeep or tank or whatever they had out there in the field. But on a controlled range, you always came in at the same altitude, the same heading, and had to have permission to drop. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of just with the ranges in itself and the communication necessary, just for the viewers who are going to watch this, my students or other folks, if you've got two flights coming in at the same time from two different directions, that could spell disaster. And communication is necessary to confirm who's in, who's off, who's waiting and standing by.
Yeah. Everybody had a range time. In other words, they didn't conflict time-wise. And you were usually allowed 30 minutes on the range. And you didn't show up early, and you didn't stay late. You dropped your ordnance, and you got out of there because another sortie was coming in to use that range. So it was very strictly controlled as far as the timing goes, and you didn't enter that range if it wasn't your time to be there.
Now, off the coast, would there be any ranges and areas set aside for dogfighting, for flights to enter in itself?
No. We now when we did air to air, yes, we had to do that out over the Med, and we had an F-100 that he would take off with the target and under his wing, and when you get up there, he was on a cable, and he would run it back there probably 2,000-3,000 feet behind him, and then he start maneuvering, and your whole purpose was to go ahead and shoot the target. And but that was all done out over the water, and the only time that you ever, anytime you did any dog fighting with another airplane, F-100, it was all dry. I mean, you couldn't arm your guns, you couldn't do anything like that. You would just try and get them in your scope, and then take a picture of them with your camera to say, okay, I got a hit on this, and then you'd show it. And sure enough, you got a hit if the picture showed him, in your scope.
So, speaking of some of the dogfighting in that situation, where you've got of course, the gun camera kill. You know, if we get back to base and let's say that you ended up shooting me down according to the picture, does that mean I owe you a drink the next time we're in the Oak Club?
No, but that would have been a courtesy event. In other words, you don't expect to have a guy that you just photographed right in your scope buy you a drink, but if he did, you didn't turn it down.
Now, in leading up to all this, of course, taking it back a bit, you do your initial training here on the F-100 in the States, and then where do you get posted to? Where's your first assignment?
Well, like I said, there were four of us that end up all four. We had 8 in our class in the F-100. 4 were National Guard, so they were going to go back to their respective units. And all 4 of the regular Air Force all went to England. 3 of us went to one base. 2 of them went to the 55th Tech Squadron, and I went to the 77th Tech Fighter Squadron. And that's part of the 20th Tech Fighter Wing at Wethersfield. And the other one went to Lakenheath in the 48th Tech Fighter Wing. So that's 3-year commitment. So we all shipped over there in about August, September of 65 through 68. We were over there just in time to pick up orders from there to go to Vietnam in 68.
Of course. Well, and being there too at that time of arrival, the Vietnam War is heating up. In August and September of 1965 by that point. And being stationed with the 20th Tactical Fighter Wing, they've been in England for quite some time. Celebrated World War II history for strafing, as well as their achievements in the air. Now, was any of that history of the 20th Fighter Group, as they were known in World War II, taught to the young pilots?
Oh, yeah. In fact, we used to have reunions with the old fighter group people. And these were all WW2 veterans. And when we first started having reunions, they would be there, and they would bring all their books and what have you about the history of the group and everything else. And every year there at the base, we would have mega big air shows, and these people a lot of times would come over and show up. And for these reunion type things, albeit just a weekend type thing. Yeah. So we interacted quite a bit with the 20th Fighter Group. Yeah.
Now, being with the 20th Tech Fighter Wing, having that interaction with the guys who kind of set the precedent and the standard, did that give you a lot of pride in knowing the unit you were with still being celebrated?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of tradition there. And there was a great sense of pride just being part of that group.
Now, what kind of traditions were still being carried on from the 20th Fighter Group days to your time with them in 1965?
One more time. Run that by me again.
So were any of the traditions kept by the 20th Fighter Group with any of their visiting pub habits, or how they just carried the manner in themselves as being in the 20th Fighter Group? Was that still carried over in 1965?
Not so much as far as things you could put your hands on tradition-wise, but just having them around telling their battle stories or war stories, and you know, the things that they did, and compared to what we were doing in the modern day airplane at that time. 100 was considered a fairly not modern airplane, but frontline airplane. So the big thing was just the lore that was handed down between the two groups.
Outstanding. Now, with that too, when you arrived with the 20th TAC Fighter Wing, did any of your squadron commanders in the 77th or any of those working and in command of the fighter wing, did they have any combat experience from Korea that were still there?
Yes. Not so much at the squadron level, but at the wing level. Our wing commander and also several people at the wing, deputy commander and what have you, were all Korean pilots, F-84 and F-86 pilots. At our squadron level, I don't recall that. Most of them, back in this is 1965, so they've been about 15 years. A lot of them were just first lieutenants, and I don't remember any of them talking about their Korean War experience. No, at the wing level, yeah, there were several, but not at the squadron level.
Well, and speaking of the squadron level, being that you were initially assigned to the 77th, what was your rank when you arrived in England?
I was first lieutenant. Uh, in those days, and they changed it, but you were a second lieutenant for a year and a half. And then you were first lieutenant. When I initially got bars, were usually 4 to 5 years, and they changed it to 3 years. So I went over there in '65, having been commissioned in '63. I went over there as a first lieutenant. And as a first lieutenant, then I made captain after 3 years. They changed everything. So in 1967, I made captain. 4 years, I guess it was, 3.5, 4 years. I made captain. So when I left there, I was a captain and a captain in Vietnam. Yep.
And when you first arrived with the 77th, as a brand new first lieutenant to the squadron, what was your first assignment? Were you assigned to flying a more experienced pilot's wing? Did you have any ground duties?
Well, everybody had what they call additional duties, and mine was to keep up. It was called the Big Pig, which were the all the nuclear routes. In other words, we had a safe room there where everybody went when they went to nuclear alert would have to take a route with them and study it and know this particular route. And that was my additional duty, was just keeping it current, keeping it up to date, and making sure that all our top secret classified documents about nuclear delivery were all kept in this one room. But that was additional duty. That was mine. As far as the other one goes, yeah, you were junior, so you were put with a more experienced pilot until and it didn't take long to learn the ropes, and so I guess probably you had to go over there and be a trainee for a period of about 3 months, where you were, before you were uh, allowed to actually lead a flight. You're always a wingman for about the first 3 months until you sort of learned the topography of the area, where you can fly, where you can't fly. There were a lot of no-fly zones over there with with all the Queen's mansions and what have you, that you didn't fly over that. That's for sure. So there was a learning curve there, but it was only a few months.
So, speaking of some of this early onset flying, being in England, I mean, what is it like flying over England compared to what you've been used to flying over the southwestern United States?
Well, they had at that time over there they had I there were no ILSs. You did GCAs, which was controlled by someone on the ground, and you did ADFs, which are radio beacon approaches, and you always had bad weather. So and controlled airspace was broken up to the point where if you're flying like from point A to point B, let's say you're going from your base in England and you're going to Aviano, Italy, you're going through 4 or 5 different sectors over there where air traffic controllers are French, they're Danish, they're Spanish, and everything else. So it was you were handed off quite a bit, and sometimes communications was rather difficult. It was all in English, but a lot of times you had to say repeat or say over or one more time with those instructions. So it was a little bit, communication was difficult over there.
So, definitely some challenges in that regard. Are there any vivid memories you have of some of those communicational aspects where you didn't have an idea of what the hell they were saying?
No, no. Generally speaking, it you have to have some things repeated more than once. But no, it wasn't that bad at all, and you got used to it. It's just just like being stationed in England for 3 years. At first, I couldn't understand what the Brits were saying, but after a short while, it comes pretty natural to you. And the same way with air traffic control, you learned over a period of time, and they were able to communicate, and you were able to receive that communication.
Now, with being, of course, overseas in England and with the Royal Air Force, was there ever any friendly competitions with the British Air Force?
No, we we used to have a lot of exchanges with them, especially with the Lightning airplane, which was a phenomenal airplane, but it didn't have much range at all. You couldn't take that thing up for more than about 40 minutes and you're out of gas. So we would not have any aerial competition against them, but we did raise quite a few glasses together. We'll fly up to this base and just have a get together and talk and chat and because we were gassing our country, so we wanted to make sure that we were took good care of them and stayed on their good side because we were being catered to and taken care of. So we intermingled with them quite a bit.
Most certainly. Now, with the 20th TAC fighter wing being there and the 48th, were there any other fighter wings in England at the time?
No, that was it. Like I said, in '70, Wethersfield closed down and they moved over to Upper Hayford. But prior to that time, they didn't have anything at Upper Hayford. So there were several bases over there, but none of them had aircraft except. Well, I'm sorry, there's one right beside Lake and Heath, but that was Matt's. That was C-141s were flying in and out of there, and I can't remember the name of the base. Starts with a C. But anyway, only two fighter wings over there were the 20th and the 48th.
Now, with those being the only two fighter wings, of course, this is being the Cold War in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Were there ever any concerns from your perspective that something might kick off against the Soviets?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was. Of course, we were dauntless. We were fearless. We were first lieutenants, and eager at the bit to have at those guys. But so there was always concern, more concern amongst the British because it was their homeland than us. We did have an interesting scenario, which I have to relate. We would oftentimes practice. We would actually launch, and we'd get out to a go-no-go point where we'd have to verify a code. And of course, we didn't, so we turned around and come back. But it was just to test the launch capability. If the crews were working together, you had to get off in a certain amount of time. So we did launch with our nuclear bombs, but we never got the word to go ahead. But in our personal supplies, our kits, when we went on nuclear alert, they would, and this is a fact. This is sort of primitive, but it was a fact. In the F-100, you were probably going to be the fourth or fifth strike on a railroad intersection, let's say. So really, in fact, all you were doing is putting a bomb in a bomb hole. It's already been bombed. But because of the effect of when you went and you left your initial point, your IP on your run-in, you had to put a patch over your eye. Because chances are, when all the bombs going off and yours going off, you're going to be blinded in that eye. So when you pulled off and you did your maneuver, whatever, it was a lay down maneuver or over the shoulder maneuver or pop up maneuver, and then you knew that your base wasn't going to be there. So we would, and we had to fly up to this base in Bergen, Norway all the time to test their turnaround capability. And this is James Bond stuff, I'll tell you. You landed up there, and of course now you're only down to one eye. I mean, theoretically, if you actually had dropped a bomb, and you land, and then all of a sudden there's airports over here, commercial airport, and you got directions. You go to the left, you go up there, and there's this big mountain like Cheyenne Mountain, and big doors open up, and they come out and they tell you inside there are airplanes stacked there. There's mess hall, there's sleeping quarters, there's everything, and it's about 7,000 foot of mountain above you.
Wow.
And so it was put there that would take a direct hit with any bomb at that time in the world. It was not going to take that base out. So that was your turnaround point because you didn't have a base to go back to in England. That was going to be wiped out. So this really, it was pretty neat. And in Bergen, Norway, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not still there, is this big mountain where they would store all the bombs and airplanes, turn them around again, and refrag them for another mission.
Wow. I mean, to consider that, of course, for the 60s period and to think about the technology that went in to build that mountain base,
Oh
that's
yeah.
phenomenal.
Well, the mountain was there to dig it out and to to retrofit that thing to handle. Now you couldn't taxi the airplane in there because it's closed in quarters, so you had to shut the engine down. And they towed you in this type of thing. Same way with going out, you had to be towed out and crank up and launch again. But once you were inside that mountain, you were safe. Yeah.
So you do this for 3 years in England and get to experience the joys of flying across the European countryside in
Oh yeah.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
And are you hearing more about Vietnam as the years go from 65 to 66 into 67?
Uh, Not really. The only communication or that we had, the Brits weren't going to tell you anything in their papers. We had the Stars and Stripes, which was a paper that was put out daily, and so what you read in there is all you got. And those, they edited what went in there, so you really didn't get any bad news about Vietnam, uh, and they didn't really hype it up or anything else. They didn't downplay it, but no, there was no heightened tension or anything else about the possibility of going to Vietnam. You knew you were going to go, and so no, it was. I guess to answer your question, no, there was no impending, uh, you know, fears or thoughts or apprehension about it at all. No.
Sure. So when did you finally receive your orders that you were bound for Southeast Asia?
Oh, I rotated out of there in August of '68, and probably about 2 months before I rotated, I got my. Well, I knew where I was going to go. I mean, I know I was going to Vietnam. I didn't know what base I was going to. So about 2 months prior, maybe 3 months, I got my. They cut my orders to go over there. Yeah.
Now, what base and now fighter wing were you assigned to in Vietnam?
Assigned to the 35th Tech Fighter Wing out of Phan Rang. They had the 614th, 615th, and 352nd Tech Fighter Squadrons there, and I was in the 615th. And Phan Rang was right next to Cam Ranh Bay, sort of. I guess you would probably call it 3 corps out of the 4 corps over there. So I arrived over there in September of '68.
What was your first impression of Vietnam finally arriving in country?
Oh, first impression. I'm sitting there and I'm down at Tan Son Nhut waiting for a C-47 or any transportation. Commercially, I flew in there on World Airways, and I'm waiting at a little terminal to get a ride up to my base. And all of a sudden, sirens go off, incoming, everything else. And so there were several of us there. We all head down to the basement or shelter, bomb shelter. And it's over in about 10 minutes. I go back up and I had left my Konica camera up there. And it was promptly stolen by the time I got back up. So I said, "Welcome to Vietnam." Welcome. I hadn't been in country more than about an hour and I've already lost a $200 camera. So that was my introduction.
Were you able to replace the camera?
I did. I on one of my R&Rs to Hong Kong, I loaded up on all sorts of stuff up there. Yeah.
So when you finally arrived to the 615th, how many men were flying with the squadron at that time?
Well, we had about 30, 32. We had 4 flights, about 8 pilots in each flight. So that was standard for an operational squadron at that time. Was about, not counting staff, not counting admin, actual online pilots, about 30, 32, I think it was, something like that. Yeah.
Now, at the time, what was the primary mission of the fighter squadron and the fighter wing?
Well, we had alert. Those were the best missions off alert because usually they were troops in contact, and but the frag missions it varied. Always air to ground. A lot of times we were air support, like Agent Orange was doing a drop or doing defoliation. 123s were used. We would fly air cap for them. A lot of times we would take off and do what we call sky spots because the weather was so bad you couldn't see the target. So they vector you over the target and you just do it like a bomber, just drop it from whatever altitude, 20,000 feet. And a lot of times, if you couldn't get in and you had like rockets on board, something like that, you couldn't land with them because a lot of times just the friction of the tires would cause the rockets to go off. And here you got live rockets going down a runway. So we go out in the South China Sea and just drop them. And I'd love to have had the salvage operation after that war because we dropped a lot of ordnance, safe dropped them, not just jettison out there in the South China Sea. Whoever went out there and salvaged that stuff made a fortune.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because a lot of times you couldn't drop for one reason or another, usually weather. And if you couldn't find a suitable air controller up there you said, hey, well, I could use you over here, then you had no choice but to drop it. Now, a lot of times if we had good bombs, we could usually find somewhere to drop those, sky spot them. But if not, we would drop them inert into the South China Sea also. And those were all 250s and 500-pound bombs. Except we also had a mission where we would carry 2,000-pound bombs, and we call them daisy cutters. And they were to make instant landing areas. And they were a 2,000-pound bomb with probably a spike on the end of it like this. So when it hit, it would detonate above ground and not in the ground. So it wouldn't dig a hole in the ground, but it would knock down, an area the size of an acre of trees and what have you. So then the choppers could come in and drop off troops and what have you. So that was, and when you drop that thing, your airplane went up about 2,000 feet. I mean, it's just the weight of it coming off, and just like being in an elevator. Woo, here we go.
So when you arrive at the squadron, how quickly is it, of course, until you're thrown up on a flight roster board and you're being told that you're flying a mission?
Oh, right away. Right away. I had enough experience that I was, thrown into. I had to have a local checkout. So I mean, just so whoever the pilot was, your instructor, just made sure that you knew what you were doing. That was one ride, and then after that, you were off on your own. And I had enough experience that I was a flight leader and a check pilot and also a test pilot over there too, because we had to do a lot of flying. Airplanes coming out of maintenance, get shot up, and we have to take them up and do a test flight on them. So right away, you're thrown into the breach over there. If you're new, and we did have a lot of first lieutenants coming over right out of F-100 training, and they required a little bit more in-country flying before they were turned loose. Yeah.
So for you, and then we can take a break if necessary. What was your first mission like over South Vietnam?
Yeah, I don't exactly remember what it was like. Most all the stuff was just fragged. In other words, 7th Air Force would come down and they'd frag certain missions for certain days. And most, honest to goodness, most of them were pretty boring. You were just, you're dropping bombs and you got a forward air controller going in there shooting Willie Pete's and marking the target, and he'd give you some BDA, some battle damage assessments, but you didn't really know. The only time that you really knew is when you're on alert and you got a scramble with troops in contact, and then you got the real juicy missions. And but I would say that. How many missions did I fly? I flew 200 missions and 194 missions, I think. And I'd say that other than the fact that the ones I flew up north with Misty FAC was always exciting. You were getting shot up pretty bad up there. We lost 28% of our troops. I mean, our shot down. But down south, only the ones on alert were really, really exciting. So most of them were just fragged. And you were going in there and dropping.
You guys shooting all this talking. Yeah, I figured you were.
Well, we're in Vietnam now, so we're making progress.
Oh, you're in Vietnam.
Thank you.
Wow, that's kind of your area. Of
So,
interest.
yeah, day-to-day flying in Vietnam wasn't that exciting. You received a lot of ground fire, but it was small arms. Yeah, it wasn't until we started flying the Ho Chi Minh Trail up north that we started getting the big stuff, up to 57 millimeter. Yeah. So anyway, day in and day out in the south, it was frag missions that weren't that exciting, except off alert, and that's when it really got exciting. Yeah. Most of those were at night.
Now, for you, down south at least, do you remember how many alert missions you took
Oh,
part
yeah,
in?
a lot. You're on alert. Let's see, at the squadron level, I had 150 missions, and probably 50 of them were off alert,
Wow.
and 100 were fragged. And then up north, it was 44, 45 missions, and they were all. You came back with a lot of holes in your airplanes, a lot of holes. Uh, so yeah, about I guess 1/3 of the flying down south was off alert.
Now, for the flying down south and those alert missions in itself, I assume you're given a brief of troops are in contact here. They've got NVA or Viet Cong pushing them from this direction, and then you've got I assume a FAC man on the ground guiding you in.
Not on the ground,
just in the air.
In the air.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, we'd have to have a FAC on target. Otherwise, we wouldn't know where to drop and what we were really, the sequence of what we were dropping, because we would be carrying. We had what we call triple ejection racks on the airplane, which was fairly new, and those each rack on each wing would hold 3 bombs, max of 250 each, so that's 6 in there, and then you got 2 rocket pods on the outside, and then you got all your 20 millimeter ammunition, and the FAC need to tell you where to drop it and what ordnance he wanted, and napalm. We carried a lot of napalm too, and the napalm was for really close contact with troops. Duck your head down, guys, and we'll fly over you and drop the napalm as close as we can, because there were troops in contact. So, but you had to have a forward air controller. Yeah.
So on those alert missions, working, of course, with the FAC, what's it like when you're lining up on your bomb or your gun run there? What's going through your mind?
Well, you don't have a lot of time. When he says you're cleared in hot, and first he marks a target, and you say, I got it. He says, okay, you're cleared in hot. You're usually about 4,000 feet, and depending upon the terrain, but that's about average. So you roll in, and most all your deliveries were done at a 45-degree angle. So your time at 45 degrees down from 4,000 feet, you've only got 5 seconds maybe to align and make the decision, where to drop or just get as close to that mark as you can. So there wasn't a lot that went through your mind. It was just bingo, pull out, and then 2 would be coming in, a different direction right behind you. Not right behind you, but I angled off quite a bit. And you'd pull up to 4,000 feet and turn back in for another drop. Yeah. So you didn't have a lot of time to think. It was once you got the clearance to drop your ordnance, you were busy. Yeah.
Now, would the FAC keep you on station until all ordnance was dispensed, including the 20 mils?
Yeah. Usually, whatever you had on board was all dispensed at one location. You didn't, you didn't save some to go to another FAC. So everything was dropped. Now on a frag mission, that was all pre-planned. Now off alert, then a lot of times off alert, we'd had some bombs, napalm, rockets in there, and all they really wanted was maybe the napalm, because that was the most effective in that particular situation. So there again, that's the time when we would go back and have ordnance left over that we hadn't expended. We drop out in the water.
So when you fly these alert missions and you come back to base, does it dwell on you the fact that you've participated in combat missions, knowing that there are results on the ground, or do you keep that in the back of your mind?
No. No, it doesn't stay in the back of your mind. You think about it. We were at our base at Phan Rang. We had ROCs. Republic of Korea did the perimeter for our base, and we were always getting rocket attacks and people infiltration and throwing ordnance over the fence and what have you. And every day when you went out in the flight line, the Koreans, the ROCs, lined up all the bodies that they had shot the night before. And they were all just laying there. So you had to walk by them on their way from your operations to your airplane. And it was just a show of what we were doing for you and a reminder of you of the cooperation that the ROCs are giving you. And they wanted your respect. And also it kept you sort of focused on what you were doing. The reason for this whole war was the guy laying on the ground there. If he had his chance, he would have killed you instead of getting killed. So that was a daily reminder from our buddies, the Koreans.
Well, with that reminder, that's a heavy reminder.
But oh yeah, big time. Yep.
Definitely serves its purpose, though. Most definitely.
And I have to say, they never infiltrated our base. They were always shot at the perimeter by these Koreans. They were good, and they send them over there just to get that experience. There wasn't anything going on in Korea, so we'll get some battle experience for these guys. We keep rotating them down to Vietnam and let them shoot some people and what have you, and bring them back and send some more down there.
Jeez,
they were tough.
No kidding. I've heard a lot of people talk about respect, Marines and Army, for respect for the Marines, most definitely.
They were crack. They were really good.
Now, speaking of course, the airfield too. I mean, you've got an O Club, but what other aspects of home or the States did guys try to bring to the airfield in itself? Are there posters up of like famous actors?
Yeah, and we had our squadron was in a nice living quarter. It was air conditioned, thank goodness. It was like a dormitory. In the middle, you had a bar, and you had the maids come in and clean up every day. But to make it not so sterile looking, we used to take, they were styrofoam boxes that they used to, 20 millimeter used to come in. And they were sort of green in color. And we'd go ahead and glue them on the wall so we'd have this, a textured look rather than just looking at a white wall. And then you do all sorts of things to make it look a little bit more customized, or so you would feel more at home. And so and we had the club was up on a hill, and it was fairly nice, and we had the Red Cross gals were there. They were always entertaining. We had movies and things like that. So, and it was always, you were flying quite a bit. You flew every other day. So you didn't, when you went to fly, the mission wasn't that long. Well, the mission up north was long. It was 4 hours with 2 refuelings each. But down south, your missions were an hour and a half. But you had to brief 2 hours ahead of time. You had to fly your mission, then you had a debrief afterwards. So it took 5 hours out of your day, and you're doing that every other day. So your free time, you didn't have a lot of free time. Well, you didn't want free time. You wanted to stay busy. Yeah.
Now, with your time in the squadron, of course, down south, when did the squadron start taking its first losses? When you were there?
Right away. I lost my wingman. This guy, he was instructor at Luke and had been grounded for vertigo. Older guy, he was a major. And he got back on flying status, and they put him on my wing, and we were flying one of these sky spots where you couldn't get down to drop the ordnance. So we were flying along, and a forward air controller was vectoring us, and he's got us on radar, and he says, "Okay, you can drop your ordnance now." Well, this guy's on my wing, and he got vertigo again, and the next thing I know, he's like this, and I saw him turn like that, and I hollered to him to get on his instruments, Down he went 20,000 feet right into the ground, never recovered. So that wasn't a bullet that brought him down. It was vertigo got him. And then my roommate, and that's when we decided to change the decor in the room after he got killed. He's he's on final. He's about 200 feet in the air and a quarter of a mile off the runway. He's got a lot of battle damage. Airplane quits running. He can't make the runway. He's already configured slow, no power. So he ejects. And bingo, seat separator comes out, kicks his butt out, parachute opens, and he's coming down, and the freaking seat comes down and hits him in the head, kills him. And that's when I got a new roommate, and I said, we got to redo this. We're superstitious. We got to redo this room. I don't want it the same as it was before. But mostly down south, we did not lose that many people, mainly because the airplane came back, bullet holes in it, but it was a good airplane. It ran. It really ran. It's when we started flying up north that we lost. We only had 157 people fly that mission, and we lost 28% of them. So that was a pretty high risk mission up there. But down in country, yeah, we lost a few, but not that many. Yeah.
Well, and of your time down south, I know with fighter pilots and fighter squadrons, you've always got some interesting antics, that guys can get up to. Did any of the guys or the squadron have any mascots while in your time down south?
No, everybody did something on their airplane. You'd paint a mascot on your airplane, and your name, and your crew chief would be on there too. So that was the extent of it. Was you get all these wild, exotic, their wives or girlfriends or, school mascots or something they would paint on the side of their airplane. Yeah.
What was on the side of yours?
Just my name and my crew chief's name. That was it.
Yeah. Who was your crew chief at the time?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't remember his name. I wish I did. I ended up I rotated from Fan Rang, then I went to Tuiwa when I started flying another mission. So I actually had two crew chiefs, and I don't remember their names.
How were the crew chiefs in your experience, though, working on the F-100s?
Good. Really, really, took a lot of pride in their work. And, of course, they had competition amongst each others on, reliability, how much, combat missions their airplane flew versus the other guys, and so it was very competitive to have an airplane that's airworthy and ready to go. Yeah, they were good.
And with a crew chief with that much pride in the aircraft, that just makes you feel 10 times better as a pilot.
And safe.
You feel
that this machine's ready to fly. You knew that he was going to do a good job. If it wasn't ready to fly, he was going to tell you it wasn't ready to fly. Yeah.
Well, for our last question for this interview segment, I always try to do this on a more positive note. Of your time in R&R, or even with something that just happened on base, is there anything that stands out to you as comical of your time?
Oh, yeah. When I went up to Tuiwa, first, backtrack. In Fan Rang, the Army had a big commissary down there. It was a big commissary that they rationed out all the food for all the camps around and everything else. And when we were down there, we got to know the colonel that ran that thing pretty good because we wanted to get steaks and things like that for our cookouts. So we give him rides in the airplane, back of the airplane. And he came endeared to us. And so now I'm up at Tuiwa, and we're having a big retirement party for one of the guys. And I said, I can get the steaks. Just give me an airplane. And Tuiwa to Fan Rang was 15-minute flight. I'll go down there and I'll get the steaks. So I call the guy up. He said, oh, yeah, I need 40 T-bones or whatever. So I go down there and put them on dry ice, and we put them in the ammo bay, where there's a big canister there where 20 Mike goes. I take off from there, and I'm just turning to go back to Tuiwa when a guy, forward air controller, says, "I need some ammunition down here. I got da 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 da." Well, I happen to have two of my guns that had 20 millimeter. I can help you out. So I go in there and I hose off these what I have left and everything, and I go back to the base and I land, and all of a sudden, all these lights are around, and here comes the commander out, and everybody's coming out, and I open my canopy and I stop and I get rid of my drag chute. I said, "What's going on?" He says, "Man, you got hydraulic fluid pouring out of your airplane." And I said, "Oh shit! I just cooked 40 steaks because they were right next to my guns, and here was no mechanical failure, but all this red blood. It looked like blood. It looked like hydraulic fluid coming out of the airplane." And needless to say, we didn't have steaks that night. I don't know what we had, but I thoroughly cooked 40 good T-bones by firing off those cannons. So it was an embarrassing moment. I didn't get in trouble for it. But I was red in the face.
That's definitely something that's going to be hard to live down.
Yeah, it was.
Well, Mr. Egan, the way that I always end all these interviews is, thank you for your service, sir. And
Thank
sincerely,
you.
welcome home.
Well, thank you very much.